Welcome to Writing for Psychology, featuring Jane Halonen, along with me, Garth Neufeld. This 7-part Psych session series features conversations around topics related to writing in psychology, from finding opportunities to finding inspiration, and so much more. Quite simply, this was my personal attempt to learn something from one of the masters in our field and to share it with you, our audience. We hope you enjoy it. All right, Jane, we are going to talk about revising our writing. And I don't know why you'd ever want to revise anything. I think just whatever comes out should just go to the publisher or wherever you're sending it, right?
Heavens, no.
But hold on. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think of revising as probably the most important step in making good writing great writing. So you absolutely, at least for me, I know there are individuals who are first draft writers. I've met one in my lifetime who's like that. And I admire her tremendously. Margaret Matlin is her name. She's a cognitive psychologist. I saw her type into a typewriter first draft text that was gorgeous, but no other mortals can do that.
Right. Okay. So, because at this point we've talked about how you come up with these great ideas and the muse taps us and we have something to say and we organize it ahead of time. We use maybe a concept map or we're using headings to work this out. And so it's not like we haven't thought about the final product, but even when we put it all down the first time, even with that kind of organization, and by the way, I think listeners are probably rolling their eyes right now. Of course you revise, maybe. But do you think people don't? Do you think people don't revise?
I think there are people who don't. I would put in that category students don't revise. Yeah. So I think professionals understand that they need to revise, but I don't think it's a given.
Okay. Yeah. So I have, I mean, you can tell me what you think of this, but in my own writing or work or whatever, I have referred to it as ruthless editing. So there is I've had to get to the point where there is no thought that I am so married to, so committed to, that I am not willing to part with it. And that has been the rule that I've had to use in order to get kind of the product that I want in the end. But I'm not a great writer like Jane Halonen. So talk to me about what you do.
I actually admire the stance that nothing is so perfect that it can't be tweaked. So I do think that when we're in the organizing stages of writing, the point is to get what we're thinking out on paper or out in the computer. But once you start thinking of it as something that needs crafting, that it needs careful attention, that's when you start taking into account, well, all right, now how does this need to be said for the audience that I have in mind? Am I using proper conventions? And probably the most recent direction that has influenced my writing is making sure that my writing is precise enough, because I have a tendency, my husband would say, to go long, that I tend to be long-winded. And that shows up in my writing in excessive dialogue, excessive text. So when I go back and look with Occam's razor in mind, I'm going to chop it and make it as simple as possible. That makes a difference in how crisply my writing can read. And I actually learned to do this kind of late in professional life. I'm going to say it was maybe 10 years ago at a NITOP session that was conducted. And I can't remember who the person is. I think it might be Georgiana, but I'm not positive, about how to make your writing more precise by looking at getting rid of words that you don't need. And that made a huge difference in the clarity of my writing.
By the way, you mentioned audience, you mentioned precise, and so I might want to revisit those. But talk to me about whose razor are you talking about?
Occam's razor.
Okay, talk to us about Occam's razor.
Occam's razor is a principle that things should be as simple as possible, also known as parsimony.
Parsimony, right.
And so Occam's razor is just a fancy way, and kind of ironic. It's not a very precise way to talk about be as simple as possible.
Well, yeah, but it works for me. When you said that, I think you said something about chopping, and that metaphor works for me as a razor, to cut things down, to chop things up. It's really nice, actually. It might even work for students better than parsimony. If I'm talking about writing. So, so preciseness, crispness. I recently I read this on Twitter. Somebody I follow who has a podcast said, very judgingly, and I like this person, but they said very judgingly, like, you need to edit. Come on, folks, you need to edit your podcast down. We don't want to hear about all this. This is why I take, an hour and a half long conversation and make it 30 minutes. And, I thought to myself, well, it depends on what you're doing. Like, so a long form podcast, sometimes people they want to hear the conversation in the back and forth. But writing's a little different, right? How do you see writing different? Because both are, and we don't need to talk about podcasting, but both are communication. I guess the writing we're talking about is more scholarly. What do you
scholarly, but I think precision makes a difference in how good your communication skills are, even if you're writing a business memo. I mean, the point there is get to the point. Don't flower things up. Don't add details that are unnecessary. Don't waste people's time. And so I think that as a guiding principle for me is important. If people are doing the honor of reading what I have to write, I want to do the honor of respecting their time and not ask them to invest in writing that's unnecessary.
Yeah. So how do you decide what to keep and what to tweak? And I noticed you said tweak and not cut. And I'm sure you cut sometimes, but I'm sure I cut a lot more just at the kind of stage of writing that I'm in, because I haven't done it as long or as much as you have. But I think as you were talking, I thought, well, she might actually cut less because her thoughts are maybe more worked out ahead of time. Maybe there's less editing for you at this stage of your career.
I wouldn't think so.
Okay.
Thank you for the compliments embedded there. But there are times when I'm writing and writing and writing, and then I end up looking at 2 pages and go, oh, what the hell? That doesn't work at all. And if I like the block that I've written, I may cut it and save it elsewhere to see if it's something that inspires a different kind of writing. But I'm not at all immune to needing to take out major passages of what I'm writing. I don't know if I'd be more efficient at it because I've been at it longer. I don't know, but I don't know if I describe my editing as ruthless. Mm-hmm. I would probably describe it as multi-layered, that as I'm reading it from different vantage points, and every vantage point gives me a different way to tweak.
Vantage point as in audience?
Audience would be one vantage point. Convention. Now let's read for APA format.
Yeah.
Now let's read for, have I blathered on when I could have made the point more concisely?
Mm-hmm. We talked about how kind of our training in writing as psychologists works against good writing, in your opinion. And so how does, I guess, traditional scholarly writing, how does that intersect with this whole kind of editing conversation? Is the spirit of academic writing, go on and make sure you cover everything in all the corners so that nobody can question whether you missed something, or how does that work in your mind?
I think it has less to do with the content of what people are talking about as it does format and convention issues. What makes writing bad? I'll give you one of my pet peeves. It's the word utilize. I go, who needs the word utilize when use will do? And yet almost every academic I know invokes the word utilize to talk about something, to sort of elevate it in a way that when I see the word utilize, I sort of laugh, because I think that says, why aren't you speaking in regular English when you can, when it's going to be easier to understand? And I see a similar phenomenon that shows up in student writing this tickles me. I call it archaic writing. When students are trying to write like they have the voice of an old English schoolmarm. So they use orientate and nowadays and oftentimes and, things that are really not consistent with good contemporary precise writing. And I try to point out, unless you're a Briton, you're a Great British citizen, then you probably shouldn't be doing that. Keep in mind, utilize. No, it's not good form.
You heard it here, folks. Avoid utilize.
Avoid utilize.
Or else Jane's going to snicker when she reads.
I will snicker if I'm reading your article and you use the word utilize, and I'm going to go, oh, come on.
Okay, so this happens at every level, from student level to kind of people well into their career who are writing. Their choice of words. It seems that the critique is that they're not clear, they're not parsimonious. And what are we doing? What are we trying to be when we're adding all of that British language?
Butt trap. I think when we're doing that, we are trying to add flourishes that we believe people will be impressed by and be reassured that we're well educated. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the impulse, I think it's understandable when you see it in students. I think it's probably understandable when you see it in professionals. But the point is that kind of writing interferes with good understanding.
Yeah.
If there's a simpler way to say what you're going to say, then use the simpler pathway.
I think we've kind of hit on something here, which is the author themselves. What this could be is kind of an insecurity coming through, right? Which actually costs us the clarity of the work that they're or the message that they're trying to get across. I know and you can't escape it, especially, I'm probably into mid-career now, but especially early career and still today, when I am sending things off to a group of great writers, professionally, or just, my colleagues. I'm thinking about my national colleagues, but even my local colleagues at the college. Man, I am thinking really hard about how I come across in that. And maybe there's been a trap set for us that sounding smart is the primary thing that should come across rather than our ideas. I wonder what the connection is there.
I would agree with that there is a premium on making sure that people understand just how smart you are. But I think the problem is if it gets caught up with obfuscating language, and there's a good example, obfuscating, then that may interfere with what your purpose is in writing. And so, again, that's why one of the layers that I review my own writing with is am I getting my point across in the simplest, most precise way possible?
Well, that's just it. Because if you use too many words that people don't understand, then they are not connecting with your ideas, right? So I like kind of one of the first ideas that you talked through, which was taking editing from an audience perspective, really thinking after you've written it, really thinking through who is going to be reading this. Because if they can't read or understand what you've written, or if they're distracted by something you've written, then what's the point? The ideas
Correct.
Aren't going to come through.
Right.
Yeah. How do you talk to your, I know we're going to talk about students here. We just kind of decided that in email correspondence last week that we're going to talk about students and student writing in our final episode. Where do you see kind of traps for students, or what kind of patterns do you see for students in editing?
Well, first of all, that they don't. Unfortunately, especially if you don't put in place some strategies for helping students pace what they're doing, if you just say, turn your paper in November 17, then you're kind of colluding with them in doing last minute crappy writing. And the vast majority of students will do last minute crappy writing, which means they'll throw on paper what they're thinking without it being well organized or well developed, or they will overquote. They'll use their selected references and cut and paste their way to a final project. But ultimately, they'll have a paper that will not cohere. It doesn't hang together well. So I think I'm always careful when I'm asking students to do any kind of project writing for me that I very carefully stage, here's what I want you to do now. And today we're going to come up with an engaging title, because I want your title to make me want to read what you're writing. And so we spend time talking about titles. All right, now today what we're going to do is we're going to write your first paragraph. And your first paragraph needs to end with some kind of thesis, some statement of what you're trying to accomplish. And to do that, a month or two out from when the paper is actually due, then means I've got the student already thinking about the purpose, the flourishes, the audience. I'm going to get better papers as a consequence. I ask them to turn in a concept map or outline at a certain point. And so by doing that, I'm pretty sure the papers turn out to be better. And I don't have that frustration very often of looking at a paper and going, why did I go into teaching? This is so awful. I'm not even sure I can get through the end of it. I'm not even sure I can find one good thing to write on this paper. Oh, good. You wrote your name on the paper. That's really good. And I really strive when I'm giving writing feedback to make sure that I highlight what the student has done well. Normally, they get a barrage of red ink. I have a short story I can tell about that, which is when I learned not to grade papers with red pens. I graded it. I was paying attention to all the errors. I made all the notes. And I turned it back to the student, and the student said, "This looks like you bled all over my paper." And that was mortifying to me, because that was not my intention at all. My intention is to build skill, not to whack students with what they can't do.
Well, that's an interesting way to think about it, because if we are passionate about what we are putting out there and the ideas we're putting out, I mean, it as a metaphor, maybe we should bleed all over our papers in some ways, that we should edit like in that kind of a way, so that somebody else isn't responsible for it, and whether that be the professor. Yeah,
I think that's also the point, that when we're grading student writing, grading writing is different than editing writing. Grading writing is looking for what's good in the writing, highlighting what's good, making some suggestions about ways for improvement, but not necessarily getting swept up in, let's correct every single thing that the student is doing wrong, because they're not going to read that. And so you're just wasting your effort.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm going to write that down. Editing versus grading. I really want to tackle that with you in our final episode. Okay. So, we've talked about how there are, we write for different purposes. And so what we've been talking about so far with your own writing, are you talking about more scholarly writing? We've talked about writing that you might do for the Chronicle. We've also talked about emails and memos, but we've been mostly talking about scholarly writing here, right?
We have been, yes.
Okay. So how does it change with different formats for you? I'm sure it's a skill you develop and it kind of works its way into all of these different areas.
I would reflect on the popular writing that I've done. I don't tend to be quite as rigorous or ruthless in rewriting and revising, because there's a spirit of spontaneity and fun that comes through in popular writing that I think if you overdo the internal critic, you're going to end up losing something. But I will say, when I do a business memo or a project report or something like that, I am that scrupulous about my writing that I'll go over it. And I think I claimed in a prior podcast, I'm a 7-draft writer, that I will go over a memo maybe 7 times to make sure that it's exactly right. And occasionally I get feedback from people about how well written my memo was. So I know that there's value in taking the time to make sure that the memo does exactly what I want it to do, that the purpose is clear, that the language is clear, the audience well in mind, that I think the payoff is that it's just better, whatever my message was is better understood.
It's making me think about this program that you can download for your I think I have it downloaded as a Chrome plugin. It's called Grammarly. I don't know if you heard of it.
I've heard of it. I haven't gone to visit it yet.
Well, it's interesting. It's slightly annoying. I do like having it on there. It does a lot of different things, but one of the things it does is it tells you if something you've just written, like what the feel is of it. So it picks up on your words and it says like, this is apologetic. Is that how you want to come across? Yeah, it's very interesting. Or this one, I don't always listen to it, but at least it's this feedback of how is my message coming across. I think another one is something along the lines of like, do you want to add some niceties here, because this is pretty just like on the nose.
I sort of wish there have been times when I could have used that assistant. When I think one other thing I've learned is never to send a first draft to anybody, especially if I'm mad. That it's so dangerous. Especially email is so tempting when you get upset to go.
Oh, and then it's in print, and then you're.
I don't do that. Whenever I'm mad, I always sleep on a message. At least I try to. There may be people out there in the audience who've been recipients of a hot memo, but I try really hard not to do that.
So if I get a 4 a.m. message from you that's still got a little bit of heat on it, I may have made you mad last night.
Perhaps. Yeah. There's a 24-hour turnaround. You'll hear from me, but it won't be quite as hot, because I think, again, the end goal is not to tarnish the relationship, but to get something fixed about the relationship. And I do think how you craft words makes a difference in that. And if you're writing, I like the Grammarly notion that someone would say, "Ooh, you're being a schmuck here."
Yeah.
That if you had that kind of feedback, I'd love to be able to introduce that program to some people that
you can send it to them.
There isn't that conscientiousness about what the emotional impact is of what you're writing.
Yeah. I write a lot in some sort of different ways. Actually, email's a lot of what I do. And a lot of what I do is trying to clarify my own thoughts. I love to work with people. I love projects. I love to be creative with people. And that is, and I think there's kind of a parallel here. Once you have a good idea, you really do need to work it down to a way, and communicate it in a way that people will understand to serve that project well. So one of the things that I've kind of learned to do is to write really pithy emails and project proposals or whatever. If somebody sends me an email these days and it is 6 paragraphs and it is dense and it is not in like the 5% like top tier of things I want to deal with today, I am glancing over it and it's hitting delete because I feel like you have not done a good job of, like, part of your responsibility is to edit your communications in such a way that it values my time. And I think I've heard you say that when you consider audience. Yeah. So I think it does work its way into all of these different areas. And so these days I'm using bold, and I'm using a lot of bullet points in my communications. And I mean, it's not super traditional. Sometimes it's not even complete sentences. So I don't know. What do you think about?
I would agree that email calls for a different approach. And while sometimes I do send long emails, I think when you're talking about the 6-paragraph email, that might be something best done with, I put together some thoughts in this attachment, which then gives greater control to the person. I don't think you can say you can't use email to communicate complicated stuff, because this is the medium by which everyone functions these days.
Yeah.
But I know students, they treetop what they do in their queue. And when they get over long things from us, they do just what you described, which is, I'll read it later, and then they don't.
Yeah. Well, and then, I mean, this could come down to how do we edit things like assignments too? I mean, I think I would be really kind of hesitant to share some of my assignments with a colleague like you, knowing that one of the things that you would see right away is, Garth, your students may be confused by that. And so it's holding up a mirror, right, with a colleague. And so I'm always, and more so, going through my assignments and trying to think about how can we edit this down so that students can really understand what's expected of them, what they're supposed to do, and what the purpose of it is. Has editing worked its way into the way that you teach?
It has. I would start with even how I construct syllabi these days. I tend to write encyclopedic syllabi, that I want students to have a guidebook to the course that includes descriptions of everything. But I now organize my syllabi according to frequently asked questions, so they can very quickly scroll to what they need to know without burdening themselves in reading absolutely everything in one sitting. And I think that format is very atypical for syllabus construction, but I think it really works well for the generation of students that I'm teaching. That'd be a good example of how thinking about precision, thinking about audience, and editing have factored into teaching strategy.
Great. So where did you learn how to, as we're wrapping up, where did you learn how to do this well, this editing process?
I think I'm going to give credit initially to my journalism teacher in high school, Mrs. Claus, and that really was her name, who was really good about taking me under her wing to teach me journalistic writing. And I started out my college career as a journalism major, but I got sidetracked into psychology. It was more fun. So I think the discipline that I learned early on how important it is to make sure that the words are right, that you're choosing the right word for the right purpose, that you're targeting the length that you've been asked to target. A lot of the discipline kinds of things, I think, go all the way back to high school.
Yeah. When you are, obviously we don't often write just by ourselves. Sometimes we write by ourselves, but often it's a partnership. It's a first, second author kind of thing. I think I know the answer, but do you have a preference to being the person who is laying out first ideas versus the person who's getting a shot at the second draft as far as editing?
So what would you guess, Garth?
I think you're probably the first.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's great, because I'm a second kind of person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love writing with people. I often recruit people. If I get an invitation to write something, I like to think about who would be a good co-writer. Sometimes that's a colleague. Sometimes it's a younger colleague in my department who might benefit from an extra pub in the tenure and promotion process. Mm-hmm. Two of my most recent projects have involved undergraduates, individuals who just graduated, to give them a little bit of that experience of publishing. So I love that process, but I usually say, here's how I need you to be a team member. I've had this invitation, it's come to me, I've got some ideas, but I need your perspective on what it is I'm going to say. So I'm going to do a brain dump for you to look at. And then I want you to react to the content, the ideas, the perspective that you have on them, whether or not you think what is being said here works. What am I missing? Anything that helps this organically move to a better place. And I've been extremely fortunate that the writing collaborations I've done have always improved whatever it was I had to say.
Yeah. So for you and Dana, who puts out the first draft usually?
We take turns.
You do?
Yeah, we do, because we're both control freaks. And the fact that we enjoy each other's company a lot, and that collaboration, that sense of camaraderie comes through in our writing. So if one of us, if we get a chronicle idea, for example, we haven't done one of those in a while. I think we've published maybe seven articles so far with the chronicle. One of us gets mad about something, and we say, we should do a chronicle. And then the other person says, you do the first draft. Okay, then I'll send it to you. And then back and forth. And so we just take turns getting mad. And whoever gets mad is the one who does the first draft. And invariably, the quality of what we produce together tends to be much better than what we would do on our own.
Okay, this brings up something for me. If we give students a group writing assignment, they unfortunately will often divide it because they want to divide the workload that way. So like I'll take pages 1 and 2 and you take pages 3 and 4 and so on. I have concerns about that, obviously, for many reasons, but it also doesn't sound like it's how you and Dana operate either, as far as one person is coming to the table with the first draft kind of worked through. And then, of course, you edit from there, right? Yes.
And I would add that the first draft is really first drafty rough. That it may be an incomplete paragraph. It may be, I'm going to talk more about this later, that it's really, really, this is just to get us moving forward. So it's not even technically a first draft. It's more, here's some stuff that I think about.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I was trying to think about, I know that we're a little bit on a rabbit trail here, but I was trying to think about how does this come back to editing? But there are times where when you're doing the earlier episodes, we talked about just the process of writing. When you're doing that, you are actually giving yourself permission to edit it later so as not to stop the creative flow, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And if I could go back and talk about student group writing just for a second, students do want to divide things up evenly, which is going to produce an uneven voice. So one of the things that I include in my rubric for group writing is make sure that the voice is unitary. And that means that ultimately one of your group members is going to have to be put in charge of doing the final polish. That normally happens anyway. It usually falls to the student who is most worried about getting an A. But I want to make sure that students understand if they're just simply going to plunk a piece into a paper, that the paper on the whole is not going to be as successful. So giving them that criterion in a rubric helps avoid that outcome.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything else that we want to say about editing, or what did we call it? The importance of revising. Anything else that we're missing?
The only thing that I would say, and I have to do this, I have to mention this out of respect for my students, is that I'm really big on helping them use the right word for the right impact. And as a consequence, my students regard me as a bit of a terrorist about using the word like as a connector when they're speaking. In fact, it's bad enough that a student once made me a little flag that I can wave that says like. So when students are doing presentations, I say, all right, if you're gonna talk to me like you're talking to like all your friends, like I'm gonna tune out what you want to tell me. Professionals don't do that. So in my classes, I'll call you on it. If you're not using words well, I want you to make your best professional foot forward. And so my students very quickly, they shape up And I don't have to deal with that problem in my class. But I think that extends to just the notion that you want to use words for a specific purpose. You want the right word for the right purpose. And if what you're trying to do is come off as professional, then that means there are certain ways that you need to be able to present managing your language. And that's a word crafting writing function as well.
Yeah. So
now, have I made you nervous about saying like? Because that's
no. As a podcaster, I'm always more cognizant of saying well, I'm getting a thought together. So now the audience can be listening for all the ums and uhs going on. There are rules. There's one. There are rules that are coming up now. For example, don't use the word like. Use different kinds of words that aren't so complicated, like utilize, use instead of utilize. So do you have any other kind of hard and fast rules that, in fact, I could see this being a little something you write at some point, which is these are, let's like boil it down to try not to make these mistakes when you're writing. Anything else from an editing perspective that you find yourself either doing when you're editing students' work or when you're editing your own work, you think to yourself, I did that again?
It's funny that you should mention that, because I do have a cheat sheet on writing for students that says, don't do these things. Good. And that includes some of the things that we've talked about. I would add one that just showed up in the 7th APA style manual, which is the improper use of while as a connector. That APA doesn't like that. And that's something that I used to do. I don't do that anymore. And I now provide feedback on try although, try whereas. Another kind of quirk that is APA formatish is data is a plural word. And so most faculty don't treat it that way, when in fact it should be. I mean, those are nuances that I will make sure are done properly in my writing. The other thing that I can't bring myself to do, I can't split infinitives. And a lot of people don't even know what that means anymore. But here it is. In Star Trek, to boldly go where no man has gone before is a split infinitive, that you substitute something between the preposition and the verb. And historically, that's an improper way to write. It should have been to go boldly where no one has gone before. And it's minor, but it is the way I have been trained. And so it bothers me that I will correct split infinitives when I don't tend to make them. But in other people's writing, I have learned now not to correct that because it's become more common use.
Oh, interesting. So the kind of writing culture does guide what is acceptable.
It guides how I give feedback.
Uh-huh.
It does not influence me to use split infinitives in my own writing. I don't do it. Can't do it.
Well, now was that a Star? That was Star Trek, right?
Star Trek. Yep.
Yeah. So now you've just ruined Star Trek for anybody who's going to go back and watch The Next Generation. Jane, thanks for this. We'll continue on in this conversation about writing.